The old man paused just inside the auditorium doors, his fingers tightening on the edges of his dress blues. The uniform, crisp and polished, seemed almost too sharp against the soft creases that time had etched across his face. He scanned the rows of seats, searching for a place to sit, unaware of the eyes that had already found him. Behind him, a group of young adults whispered with thinly veiled amusement, their words sharp and careless. "Look at that old guy playing dress-up." One sneered softly, glancing sideways. "Probably bought that at a thrift store." A second voice chuckled, adding with cruel certainty, "I bet he's not even a real soldier." The laughter was low but biting, the kind that slices deeper than loud insults. They saw a man past his prime, a relic of a forgotten era, unworthy of respect or attention. What they couldn't see was the weight he carried beneath the uniform, the scars worn not on his skin, but buried deep in memory. 3 tours through hellish combat zones. Countless nights spent watching over others as death loomed near. He had carried more than a flag. He had carried the freedom they now took for granted. Yet here he was, mistaken for a costume wearer, his sacrifice invisible to the laughter around him. But when the valedictorian finally stepped to the podium, the truth would come crashing down. Names, battles, and stories would echo through the hall, exposing the courage behind the uniform. And as the room fell silent, the young adults' smirks would fade, replaced by shame and awe. Because sometimes, the greatest lessons come wrapped in humility, and the man they mocked was a hero they would never forget. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. The spring graduation ceremony at Riverside University was the kind of event that filled the massive auditorium to capacity. Proud families streamed through the doors carrying flowers, cameras, and years of accumulated pride. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement as parents adjusted their clothes and grandparents found comfortable seats for the long ceremony ahead. Staff Sergeant William Kim stood at the back of the auditorium, scanning the rows of seats that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. At 72 years old, he had hoped to blend into the crowd, to watch his son's graduation quietly and slip away without drawing attention to himself. But finding a seat proved more challenging than he had anticipated. His dress blues, pulled from the back of his closet for this special occasion, fit differently than they had 40 years ago. The jacket was snug across his broader chest, and the pants were slightly shorter than military regulation demanded. But they were clean, pressed, and worn with the same pride he had felt the day he first put on the uniform of the United States Army. The medals on his chest told a story that few people would ever fully understand. Bronze stars, Purple Hearts, commendation ribbons that represented moments when ordinary men were called upon to do extraordinary things. Each piece of metal had been earned through sacrifice, through nights when sleep wouldn't come and days when survival wasn't guaranteed. As he made his way down the aisle, looking for an available seat, William became aware of the attention his uniform was drawing. Some people nodded respectfully when they noticed his decorations. Others looked curious but respectful. But a group of college-aged attendees near the middle section were having a different reaction entirely. "Check out Grandpa in the costume," one young man whispered loudly enough for several people to hear. "Someone should tell him Halloween isn't for another 6 months." His friends snickered, encouraged by his boldness. A young woman in the group added her own commentary. "He probably thinks he looks distinguished. It's actually kind of sad." William heard every word, but he had long ago learned to absorb such comments without reaction. In the years following Vietnam, he had grown accustomed to being misunderstood, to having his service questioned or dismissed by people who had no frame of reference for what he had experienced. He simply continued searching for a seat. The mockery continued as he passed their section. "I wonder if he bought that at a surplus store," another voice whispered. "The ribbons look fake to me. Real soldiers don't wear their uniforms to graduations." The group found this observation particularly amusing, their laughter drawing disapproving looks from older attendees who recognized something they did not. William finally found an empty seat in the back corner of the auditorium. It wasn't ideal for viewing the ceremony, but it would allow him to witness his son's moment of triumph without creating a distraction. He settled into the chair carefully, conscious of the way his uniform fit and the attention it continued to draw. As he sat there, adjusting his jacket and checking his watch, William's mind drifted back to the conversation he had with his son David 3 weeks earlier. David had called to personally invite him to the graduation ceremony, his voice filled with excitement about being named valedictorian of his law school class. "Dad, I know you don't like big crowds or formal events," David had said over the phone. "But this is important to me. I want you there. I want you to see what your sacrifices made possible." William had been reluctant at first. Public events made him uncomfortable, and he worried about being a distraction from David's special day. But David had insisted. "Please, Dad, wear your dress blues. I want people to know who you are, what you've done. I want them to understand where I came from." William had eventually agreed, though he had harbored doubts about the wisdom of wearing his military uniform to a civilian ceremony. Now, sitting in the back of the auditorium while strangers questioned his authenticity, those doubts seemed justified. Perhaps he should have worn a simple suit instead. Perhaps drawing attention to his military service would only create problems for David on what should be the happiest day of his academic career. The ceremony began with the traditional processional. Faculty members in academic robes filed onto the stage while the university band played ceremonial music. William straightened in his seat, his military bearing automatic and unconscious. Even after decades of civilian life, certain reflexes never disappeared. As the graduates began their own processional, William scanned the line of black caps and gowns looking for his son. When he spotted David among the honor students, his heart swelled with a pride that had nothing to do with academic achievement and everything to do with the man his son had become. David Kim had grown up understanding sacrifice in ways his classmates never would. He had watched his father work 2 jobs to support the family while dealing with injuries that would never fully heal. He had seen William wake up screaming from nightmares that transported him back to jungles on the other side of the world. He had witnessed the quiet dignity with which his father bore the physical and emotional scars of service. But David had also seen the strength that came from that service, the unshakable moral compass that guided William's decisions, the fierce loyalty he showed to family and country, the quiet heroism that manifested itself in countless small acts of courage and sacrifice throughout his civilian life. As David took his place with the other graduates, he spotted his father in the back corner of the auditorium. Even from a distance, he could see the pride and love in William's eyes. But he could also sense the discomfort his father felt at being the center of attention, the way he tried to make himself invisible despite wearing a uniform designed to command respect. The ceremony proceeded through the usual elements. The dean welcomed the families, the university president delivered remarks about the future, and various faculty members recognized outstanding achievements. Throughout it all, William sat quietly in his corner, trying to ignore the occasional whispered comments from the group that had noticed his uniform. "He's still sitting there," one of them observed. "I can't believe security hasn't asked him to leave." Another added, "Maybe he's someone's weird uncle. You know how some families have that one relative who shows up to everything in costume?" Their entertainment at his expense continued intermittently throughout the ceremony. William was aware of their commentary, but chose to focus instead on the pride he felt watching his son prepare to receive recognition for years of academic excellence. This was David's moment, and nothing else mattered beyond that simple fact. Finally, the moment arrived for the valedictorian address. The dean approached the podium to introduce the speaker, and William felt his heart rate increase with anticipation. He had heard David practice portions of his speech over the phone, but he didn't know exactly what his son planned to say. "Ladies and gentlemen," the dean announced, "it is my great pleasure to introduce our valedictorian, David Kim, who graduated summa cum laude with a perfect academic record and will be joining the district attorney's office as a prosecutor specializing in Veterans Affairs." David rose from his seat among the honor students and walked confidently to the podium. He was a tall, impressive young man who carried himself with quiet authority. As he adjusted the microphone and looked out over the audience, his eyes found his father's familiar figure in the back corner. For a moment, father and son locked eyes across the crowded auditorium. In that instant, years of shared struggle and sacrifice passed between them. David saw the pride in his father's face, but he also saw the loneliness of a man who had spent decades being misunderstood by a society that had forgotten the cost of the freedoms they enjoyed. David had prepared a traditional valedictorian speech about future challenges and opportunities. But standing there, looking at his father in the uniform that represented so much more than the ignorant comments it had generated, he knew he needed to say something different. Distinguished faculty, proud families, and fellow graduates, David began, his voice carrying clearly through the large auditorium. Today we celebrate not just our academic achievements, but the foundation upon which those achievements were built. We celebrate the sacrifices that made our education possible, the support that sustained us through difficult times, and the examples that showed us what true strength looks like. He paused, looking directly at his father again. William shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing that his son was about to say something that would draw attention he didn't want. "Before I continue with my prepared remarks," David said, his voice growing stronger, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone whose presence here today means more to me than any degree or honor I could receive." The auditorium grew quiet as David stepped away from the podium and faced the back corner where his father sat. Sitting in the back of this auditorium is a man who embodies everything noble about service and sacrifice. A man who taught me that true strength isn't measured by what you take, but by what you give. William's face went pale as he realized what was happening. This was exactly the kind of attention he had hoped to avoid. But David wasn't finished, and there was no stopping him now. "That man is my father, Staff Sergeant William Kim, United States Army," David announced, his voice ringing with pride. He served 3 tours of duty in Vietnam, earning 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, defending the freedom that allows us to gather here today in peace. The effect on the auditorium was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned to look toward the back corner where William sat frozen in his chair. The group that had been mocking his uniform throughout the ceremony suddenly fell silent, their faces flushing with embarrassment as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. David continued, his voice now carrying the weight of years of suppressed emotion. "My father came home from that war to a country that didn't always appreciate his service. He was spat on, called names, treated like a villain instead of a hero. But he never became bitter. He never stopped believing in the values he had fought to defend." William sat perfectly still, overwhelmed by the unexpected recognition. He had spent decades deflecting attention from his military service, preferring to let his actions speak quietly rather than his words speak loudly. But now his son was forcing him into the spotlight in a way that felt both terrifying and deeply moving. While other fathers were building careers and accumulating wealth, David continued, "My father was working 2 jobs to put me through school while dealing with injuries that still cause him pain every single day. He never complained. He never asked for recognition. He just quietly did whatever needed to be done to give his son opportunities he never had." The young adults who had been mocking William's uniform were now staring at their hands, ashamed of their behavior. Around them, other audience members were beginning to stand in recognition of what they were hearing. David's voice broke slightly as he delivered the words that would be remembered long after the ceremony ended. "Everything I am, everything I've achieved, everything I hope to become is built on the foundation of his sacrifice. Not just his service to our country, but his service to our family. His example of quiet courage, unwavering integrity, and selfless love." Then David did something that surprised everyone in the auditorium, including his father. He removed his graduation cap, placed it over his heart, and rendered a perfect military salute toward the back corner where William sat. "Thank you, Dad," he said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "For your service to our country, for your sacrifice for our family, and for showing me what it means to be a man of honor." The silence that followed lasted only a moment before the entire auditorium erupted in applause. But this wasn't polite ceremonial clapping. This was a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the building itself. People rose to their feet, turning toward William and applauding with genuine emotion. William slowly stood, overwhelmed by the recognition he had never sought but had always deserved. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he looked at his son, who was still saluting him from the stage. For the first time in decades, he felt truly seen and appreciated for who he was and what he had done. The applause continued for several minutes, with people throughout the auditorium wiping away tears as they witnessed something rare and precious, a moment when service was properly honored, when sacrifice was genuinely appreciated, and when a father's love was celebrated by an entire community. The group that had been mocking William's uniform were now standing and clapping as hard as anyone, their faces red with shame and newfound respect. They had learned something important about judging people by appearances, about the danger of mocking what they didn't understand. When the applause finally died down, David continued with his speech, but the traditional rhetoric about future challenges seemed less important now than the lesson he had just taught about recognizing the heroes who walk quietly among us. After the ceremony concluded, William found himself surrounded by people who wanted to thank him for his service and apologize for any disrespect he might have experienced. The young adults who had ridiculed his uniform approached him with genuine remorse, asking for his forgiveness and thanking him for his sacrifice. Principal Williams, who had witnessed the entire scene, approached William with tears in her eyes. "Sir," she said, "in 30 years of education, I've never seen anything more powerful than what your son just did. Thank you for raising a young man who understands the importance of honoring sacrifice." William nodded graciously, still overwhelmed by the unexpected recognition, but his eyes were fixed on David, who was making his way through the crowd toward his father. When they finally reached each other, father and son embraced while dozens of people watched, and many more wiped away tears. "I'm proud of you, son," William whispered in David's ear. "But you didn't need to do that for me." David pulled back and looked at his father with fierce love and respect. "Yes, I did, Dad. The world needs to know who you are. They need to understand what real heroes look like." As they walked out of the auditorium together, William in his dress blues and David in his graduation robes, they were followed by the kind of respect and recognition that should have been William's all along. The mockery had been replaced by admiration, the dismissal by gratitude, the misunderstanding by appreciation. In the days that followed, videos of David's salute and speech spread across social media, touching millions of people who were reminded of the debt they owed to veterans like William Kim. But for William himself, the most important moment hadn't been the public recognition. It had been the look of pride in his son's eyes as he honored his father's service in front of hundreds of people. Sometimes heroes wear uniforms that don't fit quite right anymore. Sometimes they sit in the back of rooms, hoping not to be noticed, carrying the weight of service and sacrifice with quiet dignity. Sometimes they endure mockery from people who don't understand what they're looking at, who mistake age and modesty for weakness or pretense. But sometimes, if we're very lucky, someone who loves them enough will step forward and remind us who these quiet heroes really are. Someone will have the courage to point out that the person we're dismissing as irrelevant is actually the reason we have the freedom to be so casually cruel. Someone will make us remember that behind every old soldier is a young man who answered his country's call when it mattered most. William Kim never asked for recognition. He never demanded respect. He just wore his dress blues to his son's graduation because that son had asked him to, and because sometimes wearing a uniform is the only way to honor the people who never came home to wear theirs again. And in that moment when David saluted his father, when an entire auditorium rose to acknowledge a hero they had almost overlooked, we were all reminded that the most important person in any room might be the one everyone assumes doesn't belong there. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone whose quiet service made your freedoms possible? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.